So the question I want to start out with is, what's the question that I should be asking? I'd like to think of all the surprises that I've come upon when driving autonomous vehicles, how the car is changing. And just the other day, I was talking to somebody who's looking at what we're going to do with parking spaces, because they don't think parking spaces will be needed anymore. If you're going to a big store, there might just be a line of Uber-type self-driving vehicles that drop you off and then pick you up, you load up your groceries. So how do they change that space, and what do they do with the leftover space? So what are some of the surprises for autonomous vehicles and the environment that they're reshaping? Olaf, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think one of the things that's really startling about the automotive industry, when you think about it, is that utilization of cars is very low. It's about 4 or 5% on average, which means there's a lot of inefficiencies throughout the system. So you mentioned parking. Parking is one example. Cars, when they're being underutilized, are sitting somewhere, rusting, dripping fluid onto the concrete, but they're taking up space in order to do that. So that inefficiency is, like you point out. There's another one that I think is really interesting and surprising in the long run, which is that we have a completely separate system to move people around to the system we have for moving freight around. So the UPS truck that goes around the neighborhood moves packages, and then the Uber that goes around the neighborhood moves people. But when people aren't driving cars anymore in an autonomous world, what essentially happens is that people become freight, and you can combine those two systems. So that's kind of a long-run idea, but there's a whole lot of stuff immediately happening right now that's disrupting the industry too.
And Tim, you're working on the design side. So what are some of the surprises that we wouldn't think about?
Well, I think a lot of people do say that autonomous vehicles comes in and it's going to alleviate certain traffic conditions and congestion on the road. There are some studies that suggest the opposite, that it's only going to add to the options and therefore increase congestion, certainly in cities.
That's what New York is arguing right now, that that's actually increased congestion.
Well, I mean, you only have to look at Uber coming in and it's doing exactly that. I mean, it's a new mobility provider at the end of the day. So what we're looking at is we need to ensure that the occupancy of these vehicles increase. So I think on average at the moment the statistic is 1.2 people per car, and I believe if that only goes up a smidgen to 1.4, it will dramatically decrease the usage of the roads. So what we're looking at is how can we ensure that there are more people occupying these vehicles? And what we're doing is developing services and user experiences that are comfortable for shared occupancy, specifically with strangers. How does a group of 4 or 5 angry commuters getting in a tight cabin with, by the way, no driver authority figure on board, how do we ensure that people will adopt the sharing economy in their mobility options?
Okay, so we've had some of those experiences. Uber Pool, for instance, all of a sudden you're in the car with somebody else. So what's different? What can you do in this user design interface to change that experience?
Well, there's a number of things. I know that, for example, in London, I've tried to use Uber Pool, and I have used it, but I've never shared it with anyone. People in London hate that idea of being in close proximity with a
Especially
stranger.
the English.
Especially the English, exactly. And I know that Paris had an interesting campaign where when Uber Pool came out in Paris, they had this advertisement that was, by the way, you don't have to talk to the people. It was giving you permission not to engage with the stranger, and therefore that awkward barrier was diminished. So I think that's what we're looking at, is the human psychology. What's the socio-economic, social attitudes around sharing, and how do we make it comfortable to either engage or disengage with your fellow passengers?
So I actually want to jump off that point about congestion pricing. People have this expectation that owning a car, you buy the car, and then everything after that is pretty much free, which is why people hate congestion pricing. You've already paid for the car, and now you're driving in London, and suddenly they're going to tax you extra for using that road. So the whole model of buying a car is part of the reason why we have this inefficiency that I was talking about earlier, right? Because people buy the car, and then they don't think about the marginal costs of using the vehicle at the time that they're purchasing it. So they'll buy a big truck without thinking about how much fuel gets used. And in connection with that, utilization of roads is something we don't really price. You don't, for the most part, pay for the congestion you're creating, even though it costs us money to get stuck in traffic and costs the economy tremendously to do that. So one of the great things that's happening in the shift towards, so there's a huge business model shift happening from buying cars to buying trips and rides, right? Whether you're riding in an Uber on the one hand, or you're riding on a Bird or a Lime on the other hand, you're buying a trip, right? So every time you buy that trip, you're paying the price of that trip, and that price includes all the different costs involved in using that vehicle.
Including congestion.
So it could include congestion. It doesn't include congestion so much right now. But it's not so crazy for the government to tell Uber and Lyft in San Francisco that this road at this time of day is going to cost you extra to use because of the congestion associated with it. So it's a little bit unfair to just tax Uber and Lyft in the short term, but as these services proliferate, as more and more people shift to this model, it becomes pretty easy, relatively speaking, to just bundle this cost and create a much more efficient transportation system that's actually better for everybody.
Now I want to stick with you for a second, Olaf, because I know you're based in Israel, and you're investing, you're raising money, investing in different startups. And I'm constantly drawn toward Israel because some of the most exciting technology that I've seen, particularly in self-driving cars, has come from Israel. So what parts of Israel's tech scene, the ecosystem there, excite you most, and where else beside Israel? Not the obvious ones like Silicon Valley, but where are these other scenes that you see the tech really coming alive?
Yeah, so I mean, basically what we've been seeing over the last few years is an explosion of technologies coming out of Israel. Specifically in the automotive space. So Israel once tried to make cars, it didn't go so well. We're not a ecosystem that does manufacturing at scale like Germany or Japan does, which are kind of hubs for automotive manufacturing now. What Israel does really, really well is innovation, right? We come up with new ideas, form companies, startups, and solve digital problems. And what's happening in the automotive industry right now is that the car is becoming digitized. So as a result of that, all the skill sets that Israeli entrepreneurs have been forming for the last few years, whether it's building a data marketplace, whether it's doing machine vision algorithms, whether it's cybersecurity, have all kind of just become core needs of the automotive industry. So we're seeing this migration of car makers into Israel, setting up R&D levels, R&D centers. We're seeing the senior leadership of almost every major car maker and supplier making trips to Israel, partnering with Israeli startups. We've got more than 600 mobility startups in Israel that have formed over the last few years. And if you think about Israel's greatest successes in the startup ecosystem, they're mobility startups. Mobileye, on the one hand, acquired by Intel for more than $15 billion. And I'm sure almost everybody in this room has used Waze, which is another Israeli company that Google acquired. So I think that's pretty amazing what's happening just in terms of the Israel ecosystem. I think the role we found within this ecosystem is that these founders and entrepreneurs don't really know the customers, right? There's a relatively small base of customers. It's all the car makers, suppliers. Sometimes it's tech companies like Samsung that are trying to get into the space more. Sometimes it's insurance companies or car rental companies. So we've built a network, Maniv as a fund, across this industry, basically reaching leadership in all these different car makers and suppliers. And we're trying to build a bridge that connects this innovation that's happening in the startup ecosystem to the leadership of these different companies to reach their customers.
And outside of Israel, where are places that excite you?
So I've seen a lot of interesting stuff coming out of Canada. Obviously, the different US cities. I think what we found, I mean, and Europe, there's some places in Europe like Tallinn in Estonia, where Taxify came out of. So they're really great specific technologies coming out of specific areas. I think what we're looking to do kind of going forward is also to be able to connect those ecosystems to this global network of car makers and suppliers and basically build this innovation bridge.
I don't think, I'm sorry, I don't think we can be in Lisbon and not mention Lisbon on this question, because I know that Lisbon have just launched a Smart Open Lisboa initiative where they're investing, well, there's the main transport providers, the stakeholders of Lisbon are getting together and investing in the startup scene, specifically in the mobility space. So I think it's fairly early, but I know that Lisbon is also doing a lot of great stuff in the mobility space, which I'm really looking forward to seeing how it pans out.
And of course, neither you nor I are English, but we both live in England, and we see lots of innovation in Cambridge, especially. I'm really intrigued by one thing that you're working on, and that's a program for how the blind are going to be using self-driving cars.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. This is a niche group. I love covering technology for the disabled. It's one of the most rewarding parts of my job. But what's the value there? I hate to go straight there, but what's the value for a company like yours investing that type of money and resources? What's the tie-up?
Well, us too, we're always trying to solve meaningful differences. We're not just trying to market a product. We're not creating technology for trend's sake, but we're creating technology that has a user need and a meaningful one. So I'll just give you a very quick analogy for the blind. is that the blind use Uber a lot in London because the London Underground system is very difficult to use. Unfortunately, a lot of Uber drivers will see the cane or the dog and see that they're blind and reject the fare because it's just too much hassle. And so the great thing with autonomous vehicles is that it won't have that human discrimination. So there's an opportunity here to be able to serve a need that currently isn't very well served. And we've got to remember that with technologies like this, the blind are the early adopters. So
it's so true about smartphones, the way that the blind adopted smartphones even faster than the communities at large.
And if you can imagine a smartphone, it's very heavily UI focused, which they can't see. They were instead engaging with it on a voice interface. Yep. So way before Google Assistant and Alexa was popular, the blind were already using it so that they could use their smartphones. So there's an incredible wealth of learnings that you can get ahead of the market based on this real user group. And that's what the auto industry is seeing in our work as well, because at the end of the day, if you design for the widest needs of the users, the more of the market share that you'll have.
But can you give me a concrete example? What's something that you would change in an autonomous vehicle for the blind, and how could it relate to those of us who are sighted?
So as people who can see, we take our vision for granted, of course. And so what we were observing with our research is that a lot of autonomous vehicles that were sort of perhaps conceptual, but nevertheless being invested in, they had, so I'm going to give you a very tangible example here. They had no wing mirrors, no side mirrors. The presumption being, well, there's no driver to look into those. But what our research tells us is that the blind use the wing mirrors for tactile feedback. So the curved plastic on one side, flat glass on the other side, with those two pieces of tactile information, they know which way the car is pointing, where they are in relation to the car, where the door is, how they can get in. You remove the wing mirror, the blind can't get into your autonomous vehicle.
Wow.
So we can remove the wing mirror,
yep.
But we can leave those two pieces of information behind. So we have a little sort of a nubbin of a miniaturized wing mirror that they can continue using to get into a driver's vehicle.
I think it's actually, this particular question highlights something much broader about this industry, which is, this isn't like an industry that is about moving pixels on a screen or about optimizing ad clicks on a social network. This is an industry that changes people's lives. And often the people whose lives are being transformed the most are the ones who we want to actually help the most. So if you take, for instance, Waymo, a lot of their focus is on elderly Americans who are aging alone in their homes. And self-driving cars can give them mobility rather than having their keys taken away from them. If you think about the disabled, some of them their lives have been transformed by Uber already, right? But Uber is very expensive for many of them, so autonomous vehicles have the potential to make that cheaper. If you think about where work and opportunities for good education are in America, it's not in the poorest parts of America, so transportation is a big barrier. If you're a poor family in America, it's cheaper to buy your goods at Walmart, but you need a car in order to get there. So you're disadvantaged by not having a car. So easier access to mobility means that. It means you can get to a better job. It means you can send your kids to better schools. So I think this is like something pretty amazing about this industry. And we're actually seeing, interesting that you mentioned kind of this UX angle. We've got a portfolio company called Intuition Robotics. I think they were on the stage earlier today. That's doing an elder care assistant robot where the UX is the critical piece for that. Right. You know, the interaction between the elder and the technology is part of the barrier, but smoothing this interaction can actually transform the experience. So they've been developing the system, but there's a huge pull into the automotive industry now for this kind of UX interface system.
I think the auto industry is really going to need to start being experts at the user experience just as much as they are creating the product. So anyone in the auto industry knows the term OEM, original equipment manufacturer. We've kind of, in a not so funny pun, shifted that acronym to original experience manufacturers. So we can keep that precious acronym, but at the same time, the hardware itself is still important, but now there's a new kid on the block, and that's the experience, and they need to be able to master that as well as they do the vehicle.
It is amazing how these technologies are flipping things on their head. I was just looking at the new numbers of how quickly the amount of young people getting driver's license is dropping. When I was 16 in Arizona, I was dying for that moment to go out, drive on my own, and now because of apps like Uber and the new systems available, people aren't that hot on driver's licenses. Olaf, you mentioned Waymo, Uber. We've talked about these platforms. Who is the kingmaker? There's a myth in my business, for example. Everybody says content is king. I work in television. That's really a myth. I mean, the platforms are king in television. Content is barely the prince, if even the pauper, most people believe. So will it be the car companies that you're working with? Will it be the platforms that you're investing in, like Uber, who will be the kingmakers?
I think it's obviously hard to say which are going to be the key pieces of this. I think what's clear is that these technologies are going to transform society and that consumers are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of this. But I do think there's a unique opportunity if we look at Google and Amazon as companies that are extremely valuable, part of why they're valuable is they have access to the customer. And I think the challenge for the car makers and suppliers in this industry is to access the customer. Their business is to sell and distribute cars to dealerships, and dealerships deal with the customer. So trying to interface with that customer better is a challenge. And there's going to be an opportunity, on the one hand, for companies like Uber, which have built huge marketplaces that gather data from consumers, or companies like Amazon and Google or Apple that have, everybody's got an account with them. It's not that hard, especially if you have a mapping service like Google Maps or Apple Maps, where every time you look to go from point A to point B, you type it into the map first, and then you figure out how long it's going to take, and then you open your Uber app. So that kind of user-facing interface is, I think, a very strong leverage point, and going to be a huge opportunity for those companies to leverage. But for car makers, they also need to be thinking about the consumer a lot.
And Tim, I'll give you the last word. We've got just a minute left. You work with these companies, including the traditional players, the old-school car manufacturers. Do you see hope for them? Can they innovate fast enough to catch up with the newcomers like Tesla, like Uber?
I think there is hope for them. I think there are some extreme hurdles that they need to face.
Extreme hurdles, you said?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned one backstage, just, for example, dealing with procurement. Procurement of an auto company 100 years old that's very good at buying tons of metal for the lowest cost possible. How do they quantify the cost of a user experience or a customer satisfaction, these sorts of things? Very, very difficult. And so I think there are companies who have some of the newer players. I don't really want to use Tesla, but Tesla, NIO, Byton, Lynk & Co., who don't have that 100-year legacy, a structural legacy, and are able to move much, much quicker, almost akin to the consumer electronics industry. However, before time runs out, I know that the auto industry have a valuable asset, and that's knowing what they do really well, building hardware and getting it to market at scale.
I still think that was foreshadowing, ominous at that.
Well, I think what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is actually pretty amazing. The car makers have tried to disrupt themselves. The impetus
but you said tried, though. Are they actually doing it?
They're succeeding in some ways, and they're struggling in other ways.
Right.
I think this is extremely hard to change the course of a large organization, but senior leadership in almost every company in the automotive industry is really quite committed to this in a way that when we were looking at this 5 years out, we didn't expect huge investments, acquisitions like Cruise, right. Organizations talking and hiring people they would never have hired before. So what we're seeing on the industry side has been pretty incredible. And I think that's what makes the space so exciting to work in.
Tim, I lied. I gave Olaf the last word. Quickly, if you can do it.
I think the auto industry has a chance if they collaborate and work together with others.
If they what?
Collaborate and work with others.
Got it. Olaf, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.